I'm Al Filreis, and this is PoemTalk at the Writer's House, where I have the pleasure of convening three friends to collaborate on a close, but not too close reading of some poems. We'll talk, maybe even disagree a bit, and perhaps open up the verse to a few new possibilities, and we hope gain for some poems that interest us, some new readers and listeners. And I say listeners because PoemTalk poems are available in recordings made by the poets themselves as part of our Pen Sound archive, writing.upenn.edu/pensound. Well, PoemTalk has gone back on the road. This time it's a homecoming of sorts, as we are here in Chicago, Illinois, at the Poetry Foundation. The people here at the Poetry Foundation have been our partners in distributing PoemTalk since our very first episode back in 2007. And special thanks to the staff here, Noah Fields, Caitlin Cassidy. I think we should put our hands together for Noah, who's here, who's been so fabulously helpful. Also Caitlin Cassidy, Idalmi Noriega, and others who have helped us put on this special episode before a live audience. And speaking of a live audience, yes, we have a live audience, and let them express their presence here for this recording by putting their hands together to make some noise to welcome our poem talkers. Thank you. And indeed, I'm joined here in Chicago by Laynie Browne, who traveled here from Philly as part of the Writer's House Mod Po team, whose most recent book, amazing book, highly recommended by this person here who's speaking, Translating the Lilies Back into Lists. That's the title of it, published by Wave Books way back in the summer of 2022. It's a new book, and among whose many other books is a collection of essays on the poet's novel as a form of defiance, also 2020. You were just a little productive, Laynie. And Periodic Companions of 2018, who teaches creative writing at Penn and is the coordinator of ModPo, our open online course. And by Gabi Ojeda-Sagué, a poet, critic, theorist, editor, whose books... Editor, yeah, I guess we have to think about...
I feel like that one's more true than theorist. Theorist is nice.
Okay, do you want to be a theorist?
Well, sure.
Okay, poet, critic, theorist, editor, whose books of poems include Oil and Candle, Jazzercise is a Language, did you know that? Losing Miami, and most recently, Madness, published by Nightboat Books in March of 2022, and who has long been associated with the Kelly Writers House in Philadelphia and with ModPo, and who is currently a resident of this supposedly windy city, not today, and a doctoral student at the University of Chicago. And by Lisa Fishman, a teacher and poet and a lot of other things, I'm sure, theorist, critic. Gabi, you set the biographical introduction bar high, among whose books are 24 pages and other poems, 2015, Flower Cart, 2011, and others, and recently Mad World, Mad Kings, Mad Composition, published by Wave Books in 2020, who teaches at Columbia College here in Chicago and lives in Orfordville, Wisconsin. Did I say Orfordville right?
You did.
It really does sound like a small town. How small is it?
It's 1,200 people.
It is Orfordville, of course. And
so I'll see you if you drive through.
Yeah, drive slowly. And is a dual citizen of the U.S. and Canada. Lisa, this is great. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
It's good to see you. We just met yesterday.
Yes.
Hey, yo.
This is your 6th Poem Talk.
I think that's right.
And we think we're kind of stipulating that it is a record, but we're not sure about that.
We'll have to
We're gonna get hate mail.
Hundreds of episodes.
Hate mail from someone who's been on a lot.
Yeah.
It's always good to see you, Gabi.
Good to see you. Welcome to Chicago.
Thank you so much. And Laynie Browne, hello, my friend, my colleague.
Hello. Happy to be here.
Well, today we four have gathered here at the Poetry Foundation to talk about 7 very short poems in Lisa Fishman's aforementioned recent book, Mad World, Mad Kings, Mad Composition. For viewers and listeners who are able to follow along in the book, it will help to know which 7 they are. Many people, they're mostly untitled, so I'm going to mention the first lines. It's just easier to find them. Many people have heard on page 51. Others could tell the difference on 65. Two poems have sent a point. That's a hard one to read. Good luck, Lisa. Have sent a point, and who will confess that on 73. Taking a sick day to remember Mr. Fishman on page 149. A line through a forest on page 150. And finally, steering wheel in the field, all hyphenated on page 163. Usually at the start of a Poem Talk episode, we play a recording of the poet performing the poem from the Pen Sound archive. But today we have the poet with us. So here now is Lisa Fishman herself performing these 7 poems.
Many people have heard a cat speak once, and perhaps other animals as well. This proves animals can use words. They just choose not to do so, for their whole lives in most cases. They're like monks who've taken a vow of silence with such dedication we imagine they don't speak. Others could tell the difference between the tones of bees from different hives, Carniolan and Italian, but I couldn't. Each of us held a queen in a box and lowered her down to the top bar hives Andy made. 4 boxes of bees into 4 hives equals 4 queens, 12,000 bees in all. I hadn't planned to help, felt dropped in the orchard by accident because of the bees' vibrational hum. Have sent a point from out so far, the tide returned to deepen in, and slipping on the slick steps down to water I, salt scattered, fell. Who will confess that in a bad time, some riven and arriving stone sounds clear, for the waves go back to beginning with A, breaking over the rocks. November 1st, 2nd, or 3rd. Take a sick day to remember Mr. Fishman studying French in time to be 80 March 10th. Get skiing out in the orchard. Hear a bird's drawn out of sleep. Spruce staying spruce, birch becoming birch. It isn't one thing I'm looking at. I mean, it's nothing made of ink. A line through a forest can follow a coastal line. 7 breaths later, startle a bee in the orchard. Out of the grape, it was startled. Before now, time turns around, the breadth of a hair or a bee's leg now. Steering wheel in the field is an imaginary flower on the bent down path of foxtail and weeds. Joyous to find a rusted out car there, I was 14.
Lisa Fishman reading her poems. Lovely, beautiful. Thank you, Lisa. Okay, we're going to gamify this because we've got 7 poems to talk about. I'm not sure we can do that in the time allotted. So if we miss one, I'm sorry in advance, but I think I'm a seasoned moderator, convener. I think we can get to 7. So here's what we're going to do to gamify it. Gabi first. You're going to pick a poem of the 7, and then Laynie, and then Lisa, and then I. And we'll just go from there. So what's the one that's on your mind, Gabi?
I like the last one a lot.
Let's
Steering
do
wheel
it.
in the field.
Let's do it. What do you want to say about that?
163 for the readers. Well, it's funny. When it was in text form, it was just way less clear to me its grammatical structure, right? So we have steering wheel in the field, line break, and then I could imagine it would go, is an imaginary flower on the bent down path of foxtail and weeds joyous to find a rusted out car there? I was 14. Or, joyous to find a rusted out car. There I was, 14. So in this particular way, all these poems are written where they're very condensed. There's very little punctuation. We've got a real sort of ambiguity about the direction we're taking. I think this poem kind of launches that forward.
Beautiful way to start. Laynie, it might take a while for some readers who are not familiar with names of flowers, but informal names of flowers often have that ring, steering wheel in the field. You know, so for those of us who care about flowers, we kind of know right up front that this is kind of a somewhat mistaken name for a flower, and it turns out to be part of a rusted out car. So we've got the human-made thing in nature, and this young person is sort of encountering that. You want to go from there with that?
Yeah, well, I love the juxtaposition of what we would see as kind of ruin or junk as animate and treasure. And also this idea of imaginary travel comes up for thinking about a teenager coming upon a rusted out, not physically moving, but we can imagine traveling.
Yeah. Lisa, I was 14, so I do a lot of work with survivor testimony, and often it ends when there's a sudden, big, and typically traumatic moment, a revelation for a young person. The last line in the testimony, not to elevate this too intensely, but the last line is often, I saw this thing. I was 15. I think that's literally a quote from Elie Wiesel. I was 15. Like so. So, am I wrong that this is a portrait of the poet, or at least the speaker, as a 14-year-old, telling us something amazing and revelatory that happened? And if that's the case, what the hell happened?
You are not wrong.
Oh.
Oh, that's good.
Got one.
Enjoy it. What the hell happened is fairly straightforward in a way, I suppose. However, it's fused, as far as the car goes, it is fused with something that I do with my students periodically. I like to have us invent names for imaginary flowers. And a lot of this book actually is made of things that I've done in the company of my students and with students in the classroom.
Do we have any current or former students in the audience here? Is this true? Wow, is this true? Can you let the record show? There's waving going on. Interesting teaching. Cool. Let audio listeners only understand that they are nodding and that's true. You're not making it up.
Thank you. However, it's fascinating to hear you make an echo that you're hearing with what you called with survivor testimony, which I'm not going to say more about, but there's nothing around this particular narrative, but the time of this is
So are
fraught.
we to think that this 14-year-old went out away from society or to be alone and encountered a man-made thing, junky, almost like a Williams poem, like, oh, a rusted out car, that could work, and there was some kind of revelation about the juxtaposition.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that feels true to me. And the feeling that it has this sort of almost magical quality. Because first of all, how would a car even get to this particular spot in the landscape? There's no roads to it. And a fascinating car from the 50s, so it was this really interesting object. And just sitting and going back to the ground, just becoming part of everything growing around it.
Wonderful. Okay, Laynie, pick another poem. There are 6 left.
I'm going to pick Others Could Tell the Difference. So the first one that we read, that's on page 60, Not
65,
65.
66.
51. Many people have heard a cat speak.
Oh, that's okay.
Sorry.
You threw us for a loop there. 51.
I need to put my glasses on before I speak.
Oh, this is the prose poem about the cats talking.
Correct.
All right.
Yeah.
I knew you'd pick that.
Of course. Do you want me to say why?
Please.
Well, we have so many assumptions about animals. So why is it that we associate intelligence with speech, or not just speech, but the power of speech, but speaking, as opposed to we have the power of speech and also silence can also be a way of communicating and intelligence.
Remind our listeners and also our live audience what happened here.
What happened here is there's a statement that animals, which I think is radical, that the assumption that animals don't speak is incorrect. It's actually, the truth is that they can speak, but they don't.
They hold it in. They take a vow of silence.
They don't choose to, like a monk taking a vow of silence.
Have you ever thought that, Laynie Browne,
Yes.
about a pet or an animal? Like,
Yes.
they can speak. I wish they would, but they've taken a vow of silence. I must respect that.
Right, and then they do speak in ways that don't include language.
Gabby, you're a cat person.
I
Does this
am a
ring a
cat
bell?
person. A little bit, yeah. I mean, what I like about this poem is the association of discipline with animals. Discipline is a weird human thing, we assume. It's like a weird mark of a certain kind of human enlightenment or something like that. And so I like the idea that animals are all hyper-disciplined creatures who aren't stumbling as low as us to be constantly noise-making. It's a nice twist on a simple image. I like how straightforward and kind of twisted it is.
Lisa, animals in poetry. Can you say something on that topic?
Well, they're everywhere, even when they're invisible, right? And ostensibly inaudible. It just occurred to me that how do we know they don't even speak as we do? We just don't hear them. They just do it when we're not listening. I don't know.
And why is that good for a poet or for poems or for poetry?
I think perhaps it has to do with listening to what you can't hear as well as what you can hear, and without trying to fill it in, right? Not to make something up or impose, some speech or language onto the space of where there is not speech or
Right.
sound, but to be aware of it and of its possibilities. And you could kind of stop right there with the possibilities. The possibility is that you don't know what's
That's
in that
quite
space.
brilliant. That's really great. So silence is not inability. Silence causes people to assume an inability. It's actually a choice. Silence is something that the people around us and the animals around us might be choosing. All right, Lisa, you get to pick one. This is weird.
Yes.
That's supposed to be a laugh line, people.
Okay.
The poet has to choose a favorite.
I'm going to go with Have Sent a Point from Out.
Oh, that's the hardest
and
one.
That's page 73.
Oh, I'm glad you picked that one. So it's even hard to read.
Yes.
Would you read it for us and then say what you want?
Yes. Have sent a point from out so far, the tide returned to deepen in, and slipping on the slick steps down to water, I, salt scattered, fell. I like that it's hard to read. I like that the position of every single word tells you how to read it. And I like that, having to listen or just listening for what the poem is telling us to hear and how to say it if you follow the form, if you read it with that.
Why are you so interested in the relationship between water, I'll say sea.
Mm-hmm.
I'll say sea, right?
Mm-hmm.
Water, sea, and land. You like that convergence.
Mm-hmm.
Yes?
Yes, of course, it's the place of where different elements are coming together, and that space of both things being there at once together. And then there's the human in this landscape who can enter, from one to the other, and can enter by accident, as in the poem, where it's a falling.
Gabi, Laynie, either or both of you, can you speak to the difficult, I would almost say, contorted syntax here? Gabi was referring to it in respect to another poem. I fell is the final predicate or final subject predicate pair, but it's I salt scattered fell, which I took to be almost possibly a hyphenated compound adjective and therefore classical in an HD sense. I salt scattered fell. Sounds like borrowing from the Greek. Is that what's going on? I mean, why is Lisa doing this?
I feel like there's an acknowledgement of the speaker being not separate from the elements, and that is reflected in the syntax. And this poem makes me also think of this parable of a girl made of salt who wants to find an answer about the depths of the ocean and runs into the ocean and dissolves, right? So there's both kind of a danger of disillusion, but also an acknowledgement that there's not any separateness to begin with, so that surrender is kind of part of this flow of being human and being part of the world.
And because of the falling, sorry, Gabi, and because of the falling, it's and it's slippery. So this person, this speaker, it's an I. This speaker is doing something that's likely to get them into the sea. Be careful, Gabi.
Yeah, I was actually just gonna track what Laynie was saying at a grammatical level, right? So we have sent a point from out so far. There's a kind of a slightly larger space between so far and the tide, which is a little hard for listeners to hear if you don't have the poem in front of you, but it's a slightly enlarged space, which might be replacing a that, have sent a point from out so far that the tide returned. But then when we get to deepen in, which seems to grammatically follow the tide returned, and slipping, we're now starting to merge onto the tide and the I that falls, right? Because the slipping would follow into fall. But there's no sense at which the tide returned to deepen in and slipping on the slick. Like, we have no division there between tide and I, so it all gets really sort of merged in the way that Laynie's talking about. But it's happening in this very condensed, almost imagistic poem.
Almost imagistic was a phrase just used. I referred to HD, and so now I'm going to take my turn to pick a poem, and I'm going to pick the one that's right below that one on 73. It's our fourth poem, and say something that could be totally wrong in an influence sense. This poem is the HD poem, I think, and that's appropriate. That's why I got excited when Laynie suggested that we would talk about you while visiting Chicago. You're a Chicagoan, so that would make sense. Except right here, where the Poetry Magazine has its offices, why not do an HD poem? So I'm going to read it again and ask Lisa to start. I might say a couple of HD things about it and see if you will confirm or deny, and whether HD is hovering anywhere. First of all, it begins with a classic HD rhetorical question. Who will confess that? And HD's questions are always rhetorical. Like, I know the answer and I'm about to tell you. Who will confess that in a bad time? Some riven and arriving stone. So I'm assuming riven and arriving or modifying stone. I could be wrong. Some riven and arriving stone sounds clear, for the waves go back to beginning with a breaking over the rocks. So again, HD really interested in people or a human subjectivity on the land dealing with the sea. We have the whole question almost, HD is not influenced by Whitman, but HD was interested in some of the same questions as about the ocean being our origin. And then we have this social phrase, in a bad time, which could refer to economic bad times, hard times, socially or psychologically, a depression, right? In a bad time, and time being a human interval, then we face an ocean reminding us that the waves are incessant, and it causes us to think about time in a bigger sense. And breaking, smashing, riveting, that's not a word, is an HD thing, because she wants to break apart this human idea that time is something that you could be depressed about in the last 2 weeks because something didn't go right for you. Okay, how far off am I, and would you like to elaborate on the claim that this is an HD poem?
Well, I'm happy about the claim. I welcome it. I'm sure that that she is hovering here by accident, right? Or with me being unaware of that. The awareness that I felt as the poem emerged was Stephen's a bit. And so, of course, there's some kinship and divergence there. But I loved hearing you, hear the poem in relation to her very much. She's important to me. And the article, the indefinite article that precedes breaking, I wanted to play a little bit with that as alphabet letter, the beginning of the alphabet, as well as what then initiates.
Oh my God! So
the
A
verb.
is breaking over rocks.
Yeah.
The
Going
letter
back
That's
to
why-
beginning with A. Yeah, that makes sense.
Wow, there's a lot of poetry going on here. A lot of poetry history. You've got Stevens. There's Zukofsky in there. And HD too. Wow. Laynie, Gabi, your thoughts on this before we move to another poem?
Yeah, I was thinking about one way that I would connect this to HD is that it's elemental. So we have the question, who will confess that in a bad time? And the answer is the elements will confess it for the speaker. So the human speaker doesn't need to make the confession. It's reflected in the landscape. And then thinking about the letter A, that also makes this a meta poem about writing. So we start with the alphabet again. It's not the first time this has happened. We turn to the alphabet and start again.
Lovely, thank you.
Well,
Gabi?
Lisa, you've really enlivened those last few lines for me. I'm going to be annoying and say another person that's not in the room, which is, I was thinking a lot about Eileen Miles just about 10 minutes ago, and I'm thinking about them again. And that's in part because Miles is interested in a really kind of condensed grammar and a really kind of twisty, their style's more kind of conversationalist, right? Kind of New York cool. But there's that still kind of twisted grammar. And when we were talking about I Was 14, I was thinking about Snakes, this Eileen Miles poem that just repeatedly says I was 6 in this really perverse way that's really fascinating. And I was thinking about that the weird thing of putting your age and a moment in a poem, which is so anti-moment. And I really like this section. I think there's some really interesting work, and it feels... the reason I agree with the HD thing is I feel like there's that kind of imagist impulse, a kind of density of the image, but a kind of sparse quality of the rhetoric, so to speak. So that's why it seems to make sense.
Yeah, and I think, Lisa, HD was willing to be the perfect imagist, but also at the same time to be programmatic, to say something large. So who will confess that in a bad time is not an imagist strategy. It doesn't follow the imagist manifesto. It's trying to make a metapoem out of something that could be a description of what happens when the waves crash. Well, Gabi, we have 3 poems left. We're managing this. I want you to pick one. Then
Okay.
Laynie will pick one. And then, of course, Lisa and I will be left with the only one we can pick.
Okay.
So
One we have not yet picked. So I'm going to do what is on 149 for anybody following in a book.
oh, Mr. Fishman.
Yes. Starts November 1st, 2nd, or 3rd. Take a sick day to remember Mr. Fishman.
And I hear from Lisa that that's could be considered a title, November 1st, 2nd, or 3rd. Okay, Laynie, or is odd, because if it's a diary entry, it would not be so imprecise, typically. So it's not a diary entry. It seems like a note indicating a plan or intention. Like
Yes.
November 1st, 2nd, or 3rd, I've got to take a sick day from work
Right.
in
Right.
order to do what, Laynie Browne?
In order to mourn, in order to remember.
So mourn or pre-mourn, it's not clear in the narrative, probably mourn, to remember Mr. Fishman. The poet's name is Fishman, so and this person is 80, so we're going to say it's an uncle or maybe a father. Okay, let's say father. So I'm a little confused, Laynie, by the timing, because the father either was going to turn 80 March 10th, but March 10th would be some months ahead of the intention to
Take a sick
memorialize.
day. Yeah.
Also, there's a problem of spring and winter here. So we're really, I mean, I'm like a terrible close reader because I can't get over it, Lisa. Skiing in the orchard, and there's a bird drawn out of sleep, which sounds like spring. So that sounds like March. That sounds like Dad's birthday time. So I am totally confused. Can you help me, Laynie?
Sure. I think that mourning changes time so that it's not linear. So I mean, we could imagine many things, but the way that I imagine it is that the speaker needs to take some time for reflection now as soon as possible. Maybe it's October, maybe November 1st, 2nd, or 3rd are possible days that the speaker could take. Because
Why would the child of a deceased parent need to take a sick day months before the birthday that commemorates a big year?
Because grief arises when it arises. It doesn't necessarily wait for the spring or for the death memorial or the birth memorial. Or maybe it's an important date. Maybe it's the birthday as opposed to the death day. Maybe there's a memory that day. Maybe there's other reasons why that date is. It's also around the Day of the Dead. That is the Day of the Dead. Usually is early November, the first few days of November. So it could be connected to that seasonal turning also. Because, this is really important in the book. So the book is so much in the elements and things growing and seasons and planting.
You mean Lisa's whole book?
Right. And so it's the end of the point of the wheel of time where we're moving from fall into winter. Leaves are disappearing, the energy's going down in the roots. And it's traditionally a time to connect with the other world.
That's fantastic. Gabi, what are your thoughts about this kind of mourning?
I think to the question of whether it's sort of spring or autumn or what, we do have, it isn't one thing I'm looking at as our turn away. So I do think that kind of thinking in multiple levels is a kind of grief state, or a state commissioned by grief. I also think that grief requires time in somewhat unconventional and somewhat not always commissioned ways. I always like say to people that like my dad's death anniversary is like totally unpredictable. It might be like the most boring day, or I might completely miss it, or it might be like it is the day today. It can have a sort of quality, and so. I like the flattening of time, but for me, what's really interesting here is the turn at the end, that we get a very different stanza from what's come before us, which
Yes.
it isn't one thing I'm looking at. I mean, it's nothing made of ink, which again has this kind of doubled sense, right? I don't mean to explicate all your doubled senses. I'm probably being very like teacherly about it, but I mean it's nothing made of ink, which is a nothing that is made of ink, or it's nothing made of ink, as in we got to get outside of talking about ink to get to this thing.
Ink meaning the writing.
Yeah, right. So it's unclear if it's we are really dealing with ink, or we are actually getting away from ink.
It's. We can turn to Lisa here. It's nothing made of ink could be the gesture of getting outside, taking a sick day and not writing, getting outside in order to memorialize Dad, because even though this is the result of ink, the memorialization itself, the elegy, it's pointing at a gesture of getting away from poetry. Wow, wow, wow. Before I turn to you to help us with that last gorgeous stanza, just an incredible elegy, I just want to point out in a pedestrian kind of way that spruce staying spruce because they're non-deciduous, so that would just happen right through the winter from October all the way to March. But birch becoming birch, so birch has to become birch again, and that would be March, not October. So I feel like this is a March poem. This is a Dad's turning 80 poem, birthday poem. But I love the idea that the sick day is required so much earlier. Okay, Lisa, we've said a lot. You must be just all ready to say things, but can you help us with the last fabulous stanza especially?
First, I want to just, Laynie, thank you so much for revealing to me why it felt important to, this is one of the few poems in the book that has a title, and that the title is the dating, or the, not set dating, but different possibilities, because of the connection to the cyclic, seasonal experience that you were talking about. That feels so right to me. The last stanza, with nothing, I've always haunted by the nothing at the end of the snowman.
This is totally a snowman poem. I mean, you get the spruce is in there.
Yeah.
Well, Stevens the
snowman. We've got a juniper shagged with ice.
Exactly.
And spruces in the distance.
Do you know that Al has that poem perfectly memorized?
That's not a challenge. I'm not going to recite it.
I know. I'm just saying.
But you're hearing Stevens and nothingness.
I am. And how it is something there and something not there. And the doubleness that you, of course, were hearing utterly too. And it has to be it has to be unsettled in all of those ways.
The book is full of poems, much like 6 of the 7. This is an unusual one among the 7 that we picked. It's a personal poem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's a poem that wouldn't have made it into many... I wouldn't have put it into a book, typically, in the way that I typically make my books or put them together. So this book has a lot of such poems, perhaps to its peril, but in this case, it's not anything I would ever have included. And then the way that this book happens kind of gave that permission for this one to be here.
Nice. Mm-hmm. Okay, Laynie, we have 2 more poems to talk about.
Okay.
You pick one of the 2, and we'll see if we can make relatively quick work of the 2 remaining, because
Excellent.
I want to have time for Gathering Paradise and so forth.
Okay. So let's see. We did the first one. We did not do Others Could Tell the Difference on 65, so why don't we go there?
Okay. And it's been so long since our audience heard that one read. I wonder if Lisa would be willing. This is the 4 stanza one about the bees.
Mm-hmm.
Lisa, would you be willing to reread that one, bottom of 65?
Others could tell the difference between the tones of bees from different hives, Carniolan and Italian, but I couldn't. Each of us held a queen in a box and lowered her down to the top bar hives Andy made. 4 boxes of bees into 4 hives equals 4 queens, 12,000 bees in all. I hadn't planned to help, felt dropped in the orchard by accident because of the bees' vibrational hum.
I think I'd like to direct us, partly in the interest of time, to the last stanza, because we have now a first person pronoun revealed. We have a group of friends apparently doing some beeing. What's the word for that?
Beekeeping?
Beekeeping. Well, they're sort of voluntary. They're helping out the beekeeping. It seems like the speaker knows about bees, but isn't on the inside of beekeeping society. You know.
Yeah.
I hadn't planned to help. Felt dropped in the orchard, Laynie Browne, by accident. Why? I mean, this is so right up your alley, Laynie, I think. What kind of accident is this?
I feel like this whole short poem, I keep coming back to the question of what is listening and how are our ears tuned, and also what is being useful. So the obvious thing would be, well, we're keeping bees to have honey and to repopulate our world with bees. But this is not about the bees as producers of honey, but what happens by their vibration and how does that tune humans?
Gabi?
I was gonna say, I mean, this poem feels like I don't know how to put this, like when you don't really quite get an animal, and there's other people who totally get it and they're totally used to it. I'm like, that's me with horses. Like, there's people who like really get horses and do horses, and I'm just like, no, that's like a mystical, gigantic creature, right? So there's like a little bit of that magic of distance. Others could tell the difference, but I couldn't. Is basically how this starts. And so feeling dropped in the orchard by accident, I mean, I think it's a happy accident. It's a sort of like, I'm here because it's here. I'm here because I'm here. And I'm like surrounded by this hum, which is a pretty kind of magical thing. We're also in a very, we're in a pro-bee time. We need to be pro-bee. Bees are cool. And I think this is a poem that kind of just thinks bees are really cool.
Bees are they're sort of poets. They're certainly musicians, but they might be
and
poets.
dancers,
They
for
dance,
sure.
yeah.
Yeah. Lisa, a quick thought on that last stanza and the first person pronoun?
The way you were just saying, Gabi, about it's just where I happen to be, in a way
Bee.
Oh, good Lord.
wasn't going there. But.
Let B be the finale of Seam.
Well, in a way that speaks to the presence of where I happen to live. I happen to live on this farm, and there happens to be things like beehives and orchard. So because it is around me, it sometimes gets into the poem, but it isn't ever an intention to like write about, the beautiful farm thing. It's just where I am maybe at that moment. And I felt a connection to the way you were talking about feeling the moment in the poem to the whole, in a way.
The seventh and last poem that we chose is also a bee poem, so this works out. And then I'm going to ask each of you to offer a final thought on this selection of Lisa's poems. And then we're going to do Gathering Paradise, so it's going to be fun. All right, I'll read it. Forgive me, Lisa, I'll read it. A line through a forest. This is on page 150. A line through a forest can follow a coastal line. 7 breaths later, startle a bee in the orchard. Out of the grape, it was startled. Before now, time turns around the breadth of a hair or a bee's leg. Now. Laynie, there's 2 uses of the word now. I wonder if you would riff or buzz on now. Or hum on now.
So we have in the middle, we have before now, and then at the end, we have now. So we have a certain amount of time before now, and then we're in the instant. And the language in between those 2 nows, I feel like it's trying to describe the smallest, infinitesimal, tiny, and there's a tenderness there, like unfathomable, the breadth of a hair, or a bee's leg is so tiny, and that's connected to this concept of the now.
Gabi?
Yeah, I almost feel like I wanted to say the same thing. I love a good microscopic, surgically precise kind of poem. Mostly, I think maybe because I can't write them. But I like the time turns around, then we have this indented, the breath of a hair. That's, by the way, BREADTH, as in the width.
And we have earlier 7 breaths.
We have 7 breaths, BREATHS, no D, inhalation. It's a really kind of meditative poem, I think, and one that arrives in a very kind of quiet way to say now, right? That last, it almost feels like at the end of a kind of minuet when it just goes da-da-dun, dun. That like last little Mozartian kind of ping. That feels like what the stylistic thing is here.
Lisa?
I feel like that now. There's this tension in the book. Another line elsewhere is something like, and you haven't stuck to the fact that now is a redundant word. And do we ever need to say now? For example, if you're using the word is. I don't know, but it's, of course, a larger question about what the present is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a number of the poems in this book could be called climate change poems. Forgive me, it's a category, and you're not a categorical, poem by poem, you're not a categorical kind of poet. But, we have to think urgently about the bees, and your micro-focus is one way to help poetry do that. Final thoughts. So something that you came here today wanting to say about the wholeness of the selection or of the book that you haven't had a chance to say. So, Laynie, do you have a final thought?
I do. I wanted to say something about the overall form of the book, because I think it's so amazing the way that there are so many fragments. I don't know the number of fragments. So many tiny poems that this book is constructed of, and it's put together so artfully in this flow. It's really incomparable.
Lovely.
Formally.
Thank you. Agreed. Gabi, final thought.
I think there's a little bit of envy for the cat in that the cat doesn't have to talk very often. These are poems that I think want to ring out in what isn't said and have a kind of condensation that maybe begrudgingly has to talk to get it on the page in the first place. Like there has to be some amount of language to even arrive there. And so I think that cat that we started with is sort of the little like, oh, I wish I could be that little poet,
And only speak when you want to.
When
once.
you need to be fed.
Lisa, this is odd. You're the poet. We've been talking about your poems, but do you have a final thought?
Right, just to add on to that, only speak when you can't hear me, right? Only speak when you won't know that I'm speaking. It's a vexed book. It's haunted by Laura Riding's renunciation of poetry. And so that's another way of talking about the envy of the cat. And so it's a kind of messy book, very different from all of my others. Thank you for describing it as you did, Laynie, because it could also be described less charitably in its formation. Yeah, that's all I have to say.
Well, my final thought is just to note my reaction to having read this book 3 times, twice to try to find how we would ever pick just a few poems out of it, and then the 3rd time just to get the whole sense of it. And I found it to be, at first, a book that's trying not to be overtly emotional or sentimental, to say the least, but it is those things. It is very powerfully emotional. We talked about the fact that when you mourn a parent, it's going to happen all year, and that you literally need to take a sick day, which is just a terrible irony, presumably because when we lose a parent, mostly it's due to illness, sickness, and you need a sick day. I just found Mr. Fishman to be just a great character. Yeah, good old Mr. Fishman, who didn't get to 80, I'm guessing. but not so overtly emotional. The joy. I think of William Carlos Williams, taking hikes in the Meadowlands and finding crap and shit and thinking, this is a reason for poetry. That the joy that the 14-year-old found in the rusted out car that she, as a speaker, turns into a flower is a reason for poetry in itself. That joy, that pleasure. And it's a way of saying that what we have invented in this world and in a way have used to ruin the world is not going to mess with a 14-year-old sense of natural joy. Well, we like to end Poem Talk with a minute or two of Gathering Paradise, which is a chance for us to spread wide our narrow Dickinsonian hands and gather a little something poetically good to hail or commend something or someone going on in the poetry world or the movie world or the dance world, whatever. Laynie, did you have one?
I do. I wanted to recommend a book that is the letters between Rosemary Mayer and Bernadette Mayer that is just out from the Swiss Institute. You may be familiar with the poet Bernadette Mayer. Her sister Rosemary Mayer, the late Rosemary Mayer, was an amazing visual artist and writer. And this is the first time this correspondence is published, so it's beautiful.
Great recommendation. Gabi, Gathering Paradise.
I want to shout out a book that's not out yet. But I'm hoping with the delay of our Poem Talk release and also just excitement that will be fine, which is that Nightboat Books is doing a collected of David Melnick, who I think is the best poet nobody knows about, who is a kind of gay experimentalist of the 20th century, wrote 4 relatively small books and then was just like, peace out, I'm going to live in my house and not talk to any of you ever again. And they're all really good and super mind-blowing and super weird, and I still have no idea what to do with them, and I've been reading them for a long time. So a collected is exciting.
Fabulous. Lisa, Gather Some Paradise.
Okay, so because I'm not sure if there'll be an opportunity for this to come up when we're talking about Gabi's poems later this afternoon, I want to recommend a poem by Aimé Césaire, Macumba Word, which some of my students should recognize from our first course packet. And I was it dovetailed with my reading of your book, this particular poem, Macumba Word, translated from French by Clayton Eshelman and Annette Smith. And I'm not even sure that you can access it electronically, but it's in the Jerome Rothenberg Volume 1 of Poems for the Millennium. And do you know the poem, Gabi?
I don't.
Okay, so anyway, Macumba Word. I just want you to go to paradise with that poem, be in paradise with that poem.
That's great.
Cool.
Fantastic. So Lisa has just broken the fourth wall of Poem Talkness by saying what I don't mind saying, which is that in this same space, in a few hours, we're going to be talking about poems by Gabi, from Gabi's book, Madness. And so you can find, listeners to Poem Talk can find that. It will have been done and edited and should be available through ModPo and on YouTube. So that's a great setup. My Gathering Paradise is, in fact, the aforementioned book, Madness.
We've got a lot of mad things today.
I noticed that.
Yes. Yeah. And these poems were written by our Gabi, but not really. They're poems by Luis Montes Torres. Gabi wrote them, but these are Luis's poems. And so when I ask, by shouting out this book, Madness, Zach is doing the thing that cameras are supposed to do now. By shouting out this book and asking Gabi to read one of Lou's early poems, I want to make sure that you know this is not Gabi's words, but Lou's words. And would you be willing to read an early Lou poem in the park?
Oh yeah, sure.
Kind of a steamy poem. Sorry about that.
In the park. Pretend with me waving our arms, tangling our tongues in the middle of the park, designed, unfortunately, just for this. I would like to whisper to you, if you do not believe me, I am in control. You don't need a phone. Pass by me. This is a tree. We're pretending.
Well, that's all the cats choosing not to use their words we have time for on Poem Talk today. Poem Talk at the Writers' House is a collaboration of the Center for Programs in Contemporary Writing and the Kelly Writers' House at the University of Pennsylvania and the Poetry Foundation, poetryfoundation.org. Thanks so much to my guests. This is a good time to put your hands together. Laynie Browne, Gabi Ojeda-Sagué, and our poem talker and poet featured today, Lisa Fishman. And to Poem Talk's directors and engineers today on video, Zach Gardner in the back of the room. And Chris Martin, who on audio had a harder job than you realize. Chris Martin right over here. And to Poem Talk's editor, the same Zach Gardner. And once again, we ask our fabulous live audience to register their appreciation of our Poem Talkers by putting their hands together again. Next time on Poem Talk, I'll be back in Philadelphia, joined by Kate Colby, Jonathan Dick, and Bethany Swan to talk about a poem called Long Light by Hua Nguyen. This is Al Filreis, and I hope you'll join us for that or another episode of Poem Talk.